We've got 15 on already, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, and people will keep coming on, and Ryan will let them in. So I would like to introduce to you Professor Burnis R. Morris. He is the Carter G. Woodson Professor of Journalism and Mass Communications and co-founder and director of the Woodson, pronounce that for me.
Lyceum
at Marshall University. Professor Morris also founded the Institute on Black History in 2017 with major grants from West Virginia Humanities Council. The Institute's fourth class of teachers will convene June 19th to 23rd, 2021. In 2020, he was named a National Trailblazer of Diversity by the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. He previously created the Fourth Estate in the Third Sector, a national training program for journalists who cover tax-exempt organizations and philanthropy, which was founded by Knight Foundation. He is the author of 3 published books, including Carter G. Woodson, History, the Black Press, and Public Relations, University Press of Mississippi, 2017, which prompted Time 2019 and AARP 2020 magazines to feature his work in their Black History Month coverage. He contributed an essay to the upcoming Radical Roots, Public History and Social Justice, Amherst College Press, 2021, a volume with more than 20 public history collaborators. Professor Morris, former Assistant Chair of Faculty Senate, received the John Marshall University Scholars Award, 2018, Distinguished Artisan Scholars Award for Senior Faculty, 2016, and was named a Distinguished Drinko Fellow, 2011. He was also named a West Virginia History Hero, 2016, Emory University's Carter G. Woodson Fellow, 2012, Freedom Forum First Amendment Visiting Professor, Professional Scholar, Vanderbilt, 1994 to 1995, NEH Summer Fellow for Journalists to study modern fiction, and a New York Times intern. He was the first Black student at the university to be selected for Who's Who in American Colleges and Universities. He earned a BA in journalism at the University of Mississippi and MPA at University of Dayton. Before college teaching, Professor Morris was a reporter and editor at several of the nation's leading newspapers, including the Atlantic Constitution and other papers owned by Cox Newspapers. He also was assistant business manager at the Palm Beach Post and Austin American Statesman, both Cox papers, before becoming director of marketing services and director of community relations at the Austin newspaper. And we are so thankful and appreciative that you're joining us today, Professor Morris, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well,
thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to have been invited to speak to this group about a great topic. But before I get started, you stumble through Lyceum, and that's okay. I love it when it happens, because it gives me a chance to plug the Dr. Carter G. Woodson Lyceum, which is part of my one of my passions nowadays. Dr. Alan Gould, the late Dr. Alan Gould, and I co-founded the Woodson Lyceum, and the name was his idea, the Lyceum part, because it was Aristotle's first school, and he was unaware that the University of Mississippi's original building, and still is the administration building, is called the Lyceum. And I told him we may have a problem because we had a new president who was coming in from Mississippi State University, a rival of Ole Miss. And Dr. Gould said, "Oh, you think he'll know about the Ole Miss Lyceum?" I said, "Oh, yes, he'll know." I tell this story many times, but the president doesn't mind. He's a good sport about it. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I usually do Teams, but let's see if I'm a good student from Ryan Vance showing me how to share my screen today. We'll be in good shape. And now you should see my screen. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. If you notice in the title, I wanted to adjust amend the title that Elizabeth gave me, because I think of print as a delivery system rather than the journalism itself. I think in terms of whether it's online or in print or on the air as simply journalism. So I put that in parentheses so that you guys will understand where I'm coming from at the outset. Okay. First, I want to let you know I don't mind being interrupted. So if I say something you want to react to, or if you have some additional thoughts, just speak up. I don't mind at all. Let's take a short tour of newspaper history for clues about the future that I want to share with you. No, we're not going back to Gutenberg's press. It's going to be more recent than that. When you hear the word journalist, what roles come to mind? Just give it some thought, just a couple of seconds. What do you think of in terms of a journalist's roles? If you want to write down one thing or several things, think of them. And at the end of the discussion, we can compare your list with my list. Historically, journalists have been nation builders. I put in parentheses unifiers because journalists very often have the community behind them in their editorial comments and in their news, which is designed to serve the entire community or the entire country. I'll speak more about that in a second. Also, journalists are agents of change, instruments of truth, information providers and gatekeepers, and educators. Yes, journalists are educators. First, I want to think about the role as nation builders. Benjamin Franklin, one of the founders, was a member of the press. He owned several newspapers. In many circumstances, in your other studies, you probably thought of Franklin as an inventor or a founder, but you can see as owner of a newspaper, he was very much active in journalism too, in building the country. Another of the nation's founders is Alexander Hamilton, who was also founder of the New York Evening Post. It was a different newspaper when he founded it than it is today, obviously. And then you think of newspapers as agents of change. You may recall William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator, Frederick Douglass's newspaper, North Star. Of course, many mainstream journalists resisted abolition of slavery and civil rights and women's rights. And especially in the South, where they were slow to support these causes. But again, they reflected their region, which is often the case with journalists. Many of them believe they're supposed to mirror their community's interests. Truth. The strongest argument for journalism is truth. You know, journalists believe they are purveyors of truth, instruments of truth. And we can go back as far as John Peter Zenger, whose libel trial used truth as a defense, even before truth was allowed as a defense in a libel case. He lost the suit, but as you know, it was truth was established after that as a major defense in libel cases. The foundation of American journalism is truth. We don't always tell the truth, but we believe in the truth. Very often we don't know what truth is. And so we quote one side of a controversy and the other side of the controversy, knowing that is not necessarily the truth, but it's as close as we can get by giving the views of all sides that we can identify. We don't believe that people are entitled to their own facts. We believe that there is one set of facts and we try to discover them. Carter G. Woodson used the press to expose lies of unscrupulous historians. He believed if you told the truth about Black history, it would expand the respect for African Americans. He dealt with the truth. He corrected historical records. And his allies in popularizing history was the Black press. And it was probably the finest hour for the American Black newspapers. Watergate, one of the major scandals of the 20th century, was about exposing the truth. Why did these bandits break into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee? And as they unraveled the story and found more truth, we got a full picture of what was going on. I am from that era. I was introduced to journalism during Watergate. And my generation of journalists believe in an independent press where we're not in bed with the people we cover, that we represent the interests of the public. We may have allies in the various people we cover, in the political interests we cover, but we're not in bed with them. And that's a major difference that we will discuss as I go on. In terms of information providers, I have the Parthenon here, I have WMUL. They just, typically journalists provide a service. They tell you as much as they can find out about what's going on in the community around us. As educators, I'm guessing that some of you doubt that journalists are educators, but I believe that that we are. And the earliest American publication known to acknowledge newspapers' roles in education was Massachusetts Portland Eastern Herald, which printed this statement in 1795. Much has been said and written on the utility of newspapers, but one principal advantage that might be derived from these publications has been neglected. We mean that of reading them in schools and by the children in families. The key to the future for American newspapers, all media, is converting teenagers into readers and viewers. Historically, the press had low numbers among young people, but as soon as these young people became, started their families, bought homes, became involved in their communities. They became heavy consumers of newspapers. I think the current generation of young people has been reluctant to make that transition because social media is a new phenomenon, and we'll have to look more into how we can still serve the public and be aware that social media is out there interrupting this transition from just being a normal teenager to being a responsible adult, learning to be a good citizen by consuming newspaper news and newspapers and magazines. I have this quotation that's on the screen in my book about how Carter G. Woodson used the press. And I wanted to discuss the newspapers in education, and I wasn't certain that newspapers in education, many newspapers have departments called newspapers in education. When I was at the Austin newspaper, that department reported to me. And so I called Ed Dawson when I was drafting my book and asked him if NIE was still significant. And he said it was. And so I think, well, whether they're making money from it or not doesn't matter, but it's an investment in their future. Okay. Print lives, but what if it fades away? Again, I'm saying that the paper is printed on is not necessarily the journalism. Journalism is much bigger than how it's delivered to your homes. As consumers, you shouldn't worry about how news is delivered. As consumers, don't worry about the platforms, print, broadcast, digital, new technologies. Instead, worry about a free and independent press. Make certain in your support of the press, because journalists also need to make certain that they are following their past and commitment to the people they serve. Organizations supporting journalism should return to their watchdog roots. And by watchdog roots, I mean journalists are making certain that the public learns what happens to its tax dollars, what the government officials are doing when they are supposedly serving their citizens. It's a role that journalists own that social media cannot do. Journalists have a monopoly as a watchdog. Social media cannot replicate that. That is a strong point in the future of journalism. We can do what the nation's founders thought we would do. There are several areas where Jefferson's ideas still matter. One is on the press. Journalists love to quote the young Thomas Jefferson when he advocated a strong support for newspapers. He may have changed later when he became president, when there were so many newspapers opposed to many of the things he was doing. But he anticipated the criticism as a young man. This quotation came from like 1787. Remember, he became president in 1801. And it says, "The people are the only censors of their governors. Even their errors will tend to keep these to the true principles of their institution. To punish these errors too severely would be to suppress the only safeguard of the public liberty. The way to prevent these irregular interpositions of the people is to give them full information of their affairs through the channel of the public papers, and to contrive that those papers should penetrate the whole mass of the people. The basis of our governments being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. But I should mean that every man should receive those papers and be capable of reading them. You know, what really scares me is this line of that you would have a choice between a government with newspapers or a government with or papers without a government. The newspaper industry has been financially in such a weakened position. I don't want to think in terms of their disappearing. And I don't believe that they will, because there is great demand for what they do. It just may not be on paper. Journalists have to remain independent. I stress that over and over as part of what I envision as their future. They must learn. And as part of the learning, they must be better educated to become unifying forces, to reach diverse elements. You know, I know young journalists who don't realize they're supposed to understand how government, business, and the economy work. They like to avoid numbers, and you really can't avoid numbers when you're covering government, business, and the economy. I speak as a former business editor. I speak as someone who got a master's degree in public administration because I wanted to be an expert on government policies. Until the mid-20th century, many believed that journalism was a calling. And people who think in terms of a calling are like comparing journalists to pastors. You know, many people who become pastors do so because they felt it was a calling. Carnegie Woodson addressed this issue of the calling. Some of you are aware that Woodson was received his high school diploma in Huntington, and he was principal of the old Douglas School. And he went off to great fame in Washington. He taught in the school system for 10 years before he became the liberal arts dean at Howard University. He didn't last long as dean at Howard, but during that 1 year as dean, one of his final pieces of writing that year was a piece in the Howard Record, in which he talked about the kind of education that journalists should receive. And then he returned to West Virginia as dean at what was then called West Virginia Collegiate Institute, which is now West Virginia State University. But Woodson begins his article on the education of journalists. And I present it to you as I presented it in my book, because even though he wrote this a century ago, is exactly what journalists should be doing today in order to have a future. And he said, speaking to the writer himself recently about the need of trained men in the field of journalism, a well-known publicist remarked that most of our successful editors are uneducated men. A century ago, even 50 years ago, there was a great debate among journalists as to whether you need to go to college in order to practice journalism. And this is one of the things Whitson is addressing. He said, one fact after another was suggested as the probable cause of the attraction of the untrained to this work, in which they usually achieve popular success. Whereas few of our college men venture thereupon, and those who do cannot function so efficiently as editors of less formal education, as one will not conclude that because a man with one arm happens to succeed as a farmer, that the amputation was helpful. So it must not be thought that to become a good editor, one must be ignorant. It is evident, however, that such education as most of our young men acquire too often falls short of equipping them for fulfilling a calling in the present age. In no sense is this more evident than in the field of journalism. Now, both Jefferson and Whitson spoke of news people as men. They were primarily men in those days. I'm certain that Whitson, if you were writing today, would include female journalists, because he was not known to be a sexist. But Whitson went on. This may seem very much like the utilitarian idea emphasized so much recently by advocates of industrial education. Industrial education was what many people refer to Booker T. Washington's plan for educating Blacks. Many of his critics thought he was training people to for education in obsolete jobs, jobs that would not threaten whites. And the way Woodson addresses this point makes it sound like it's okay to get an industrial education. It's okay to be trained for hard labor jobs, but you need more than that to be a full person. You need to learn more than just the basics of surviving. He said the advocates of industrial education would do much better if they would make actual education the development of power to function better along the line the individual may be called upon to serve. The application of this broad principle would make all education practical and at the same time cultural. Journalism is as practical as carpentry, but requires a foundation in education of the highest sort. The journalist of tomorrow must be well versed in philosophy, history, sociology, economics, language, and literature, correlated with technical instruction in the methods of journalism and advertising. Okay. I think his recommendation was significant a century ago and is as significant today. I think that it's okay if the New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, CBS want to compete with the large social media organizations like Facebook. because they have large national platforms too. But the smaller news organizations, which really the typical American news organization is small. The small news organizations must reestablish their primacy in local news. That's what their readers want. That's what their viewers want. They are not going to knock out Facebook. A newspaper with 30,000 circulation cannot compete effectively with Facebook, but it can own its own market. It can be a mass medium in its own market. During most of the American press history, journalists have been gatekeepers, screening news and events and determining what their readers, viewers, and listeners would learn. Now the digital age has empowered large numbers of media consumers and their influencers to choose their selections of news. But they still need to be informed, and we know what audiences want. It's what journalists should be prepared to deliver. Content consumers want, and usually when I speak to my students, they love it when I say drum roll, they start making noise, beating their desks. And that energizes me to go on to the next slide. Here is a survey that indicates where the news media are. Local TV stations are turned to most for local news, primarily through the TV set, and most other providers, larger digital share. Where Americans get local news, 80% TV stations, 79% radio stations, 68% daily newspapers, 64% from some other local organizations, and so on down the list. Is the type big enough for you guys to read? Diane, Elizabeth?
Yes.
Okay, good. But you can see that local is the present and the future of the legacy media, newspapers, television stations, radio stations. Okay. And many of their consumers are getting this information online, as well as the hard copies of the paper, or just watching it on television. Okay. Many people like me do both. Okay. What kind of local news should journalists be offering? There's a nice list here. Weather is the most popular. You ever wonder why in a 30-minute local news broadcast, you get updates on the weather 4 or 5 times? And they don't say anything new, but they just tell you over and over what they had told you previously. But the list of things that people want, and is here. And the question is, are they giving you things that are important for daily life? And on weather, 70% said important for daily life. Crime, 44. Traffic and transportation, 41. Crisis 37, Government and Politics, etc. Now remember, you probably have friends, and you may have complained yourself that there's too much crime on television, too much crime in the newspapers. But look at the list. It's number 2 on the list. This is what people are saying, how important it is. And as journalists, we're supposed to give people information that they find significant. This is in their future. Regardless of whether it's on paper you can hold in your hands, which I hope will be around forever, but if not, we're not losing journalism. It may be on the air. If not, it may be online eventually, totally. But right now, we are blessed with being able to find what we want through hard copies, on the air, or online. Now, we have a problem, though, with one brand of newspaper or TV station reaching all viewers, reaching all readers. When I began as a young journalist, 80% of adults were reading newspapers. 80% were watching evening news on the 3 networks. We only had 3 in those days. But there are many different choices now. Plus, the market is more fragmented based on political views. If you notice the headline here, Fox News dominated as main campaign news source for Trump voters, but no single source as pronounced among Clinton voters. Trump voters got their information primarily from Fox. Hillary Clinton's voters got their news from a variety of sources, although it appears they favored CNN over the others. But if you look at the overall, there is a variety of sources on the left there for all voters. And the Fox News is tops only because Fox is so lopsided as a news source for the Trump voters. It has made Fox News quite wealthy. And you can argue that it panders to the news requirements of the people it has identified as its viewers. It is a troubling set of numbers because if journalists are going to identify the community, unify their communities, they must be able to reach most of the people with their messages. And remember, I say that the future for journalists is concentrating on local news. On this list, only 3% of voters in the Clinton-Trump race got their news from local newspapers, 7% from local TV. But that's understandable. Clinton and Trump were national news. And you can argue that it bolsters my position that the local news outlets should have a monopoly on news in their markets. Monopoly not in an economic sense that would cause them antitrust problems, but in the sense of their being so well tuned into what's going on that they truly inform and educate their communities about what's happening within that community. Now, social media, a growing share of Americans say they use YouTube, Facebook, use YouTube, and Facebook remains one of the most widely used online platforms among US adults. And you can see that there's a large percentage of people getting their news through social media. Now, a more recent SurveyMonkey study found that teens get their news more frequently from social media than directly from news organizations. More than half of teens get news from social media, and 50% get news from YouTube at least a few times a week. Fewer than half get news reported by news organizations in print or online at least a few times a week. And only 37% get news on TV at least a few times a week. This is the group that we have to hope transitions into being the historical audiences for traditional news media. Will they at some point rely less on social media and more on our newspapers and TV stations? Historically, they have, but historically nowadays includes young adults who have access to social media. And we don't know if they will make the switch as other generations did in adopting the traditional forms of media. Nearly 2 in 3 teens who get news directly from news organizations say doing so has helped them better understand current events, compared with 59% of teens who get their news from YouTube. I think that is a major statistic that should help us, should help the news media take a more optimistic view that this group eventually may move in their direction. When nearly 2 in 3 teens who get news directly from news organizations say doing so has helped them understand current events, compared with the social media. Nearly 2 in 10 teens say that getting news from social media has made them more confused about current events. And I'm not surprised about the confusion. An argument for an independent press, the role as an independent, providing oversight, not companionship. Journalists should keep their distance from sources. We don't need to get in bed with our sources. This is not a picture of independent journalism. This one might be. See, this happy dog is in bed by himself. I am not advocating divorce from politics. Newspapers and their key players have been heavily involved in political activities from the start of the Republic. I know a couple of people's names I saw are actually historians, and they're familiar with the party press period, where the political parties controlled newspapers that they were allied with. I don't think it's happened that much with newspapers recently, although there are some exceptions like the New York Post. But for the most part, the closeness of media to political parties would be cable television news. It is a significant closeness, though, one involving billions of dollars in profits. And I'm hoping that journalists who want independence will eventually win out. But there's a history of it. Journalists haven't always been separated from the people they cover. One example I often offer is Henry J. Raymond, who was founder of the New York Times, was a journalist, politician, who helped Abraham Lincoln's reelection campaign. And he was chair of the Republican National Committee. I told this story several years ago at LSU, and during a break, a woman came up to me and told me that Raymond was her great grandfather. And so I said, oh, well, thank you very much. But I do think that even though I liked the side he was on, it was too close for him to be covering Lincoln and to be campaign manager and chair of the Republican National Committee. At one time, I think Raymond was also lieutenant governor of New York. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, advised Lincoln in an editorial to confiscate property of the Confederate States and free the slaves, in a very famous editorial called The Prayer of 20 Millions. This is a more traditional role for editors of newspapers. They write editorials demanding action on this or that. We recognize and we respect journalists in that role. But later, Greeley was nominee for president in 1868. There have been many journalists who have wanted to be president. There have been many journalists who have served in Congress. Some of you may be unaware of the fact that Al Gore was a journalist at the Nashville Tennessean before he got in politics. He was an Army journalist during Vietnam. Dan Quayle comes from a publishing family in Indiana. He was associate publisher of his family newspaper. Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst both served stints in Congress. I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but when they do, they should give up their editors' roles. Ohio newspaper publishers, James Cox, I worked for Cox Newspapers, which he founded, and Warren Harding were nominees for president. They were opponents in 1920. Cox's running mate was Franklin Roosevelt, himself with a newspaper background as former editor of the Harvard Crimson. And I just mentioned Dan Quayle had newspaper roots in Indiana. I say all this in showing this relationship between journalism and politics and both local news and national news, because it is fundamental to their future. Ask yourselves what kind of news organization Fox News would be without the GOP, or MSNBC without the Democratic Party. The relationship, whether close in bed or distant in single beds, in separate rooms, is important. We often disagree about freedom of speech, but we all agree that political speech, the right to criticize or disagree with people holding office, is the strongest form of free speech. The future of journalism. I think the future can be found in looking at the role that journalists, at the roles, not just one, at the roles of journalists should be as the roles they should be performing as. Agents of change, instruments of truth, information providers, and gatekeepers, even educators. Here's our single bed where they are independent, keeping their distance. And my final thoughts before I let you challenge me with your questions is the future of journalism, not just print journalism, is maintaining independence, not collaboration, keeping distance from sources. Don't waste time acting like mini Facebooks, unless the organization is New York Times, Washington Post, with billionaires holding them up. Billionaires can absorb the financial losses if necessary. They should develop business models that support independent journalism based on local news superiority. Your thoughts. Does your list of roles for the future of print relate to my list? And is your assessment of the future of print the same as my assessment? And I'm going to stop sharing so that I can return and see you guys. Okay. Madam Moderator, I'm turning it back to you and let you ask if they have questions or want to provide their feedback.
Okay, I will just start by saying that I'm a news junkie, but I don't have time to read all the newspapers out there. And I do, maybe I'm like a college student, I do get a lot of my news from Facebook because I have liked certain news sources and a variety of news sources. And to me, it's not that it's free, but it's right there at my fingertips, and I can click on it and I can quickly scroll through it. Do I want to read it? And then sometimes when I see an article and I'm like, I love to see the comments. I do, because that also engages you. Not that I sit and comment, but yes, it gives you different perspectives of the same article. And so I do like online print journalism for that reason.
Mhm.
is that you can get different perspectives and it's right there at your fingertips, but I also don't want to see the hard copies disappear.
Mhm.
I like feeling and touching newspaper too.
But
Anybody?
you can participate online with the online New York Times, right? You can write your comments and stuff. But the younger people are not doing that. They they go to, when they say social media, I think they're talking about some obscure website, some comedian's comments about something, or some girlfriend who said something.
We have some journalists in among our group today.
Oh no, I'm
Diane.
nervous now.
Oh, Diane writes the newspaper on a regular
Yes.
basis. So I'm going to turn it over to the group and let them have a discussion.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for the really informative information about journalism and essentially where we're going, whether we like it or not. I'm one of those people who grew up with morning coffee and print newspapers. They both feel right together. But I think that may be something just about ready to disappear in too many places. Do you have some statistics on the percent of young people, and I don't know what we call them, but at least 30 and under, who actually are reading print journalism?
I don't have numbers, but it's going to be extremely low. It's always been low for young readers. Our concern today is because they are competing, print is competing for their attention with all these other sources that didn't exist. Remember when I was a young editor at the Atlanta Constitution, Ted Turner invented 24-hour news. We didn't have all these extra channels. We didn't have all the internet sources that we have. And so my concern is the historic gap between young families, which is always low, and they're becoming heavy consumers of the media like you and I and our friends, that the gap won't close very much. We need to find a way to narrow that gap in order for our local newspapers to make money. And by making money, they can increase their staffs, or at least not cut them, and cover the issues that we need covered. I don't know the numbers, but the numbers have always been low.
And probably going lower.
That is my fear. We need to find a way to convert them.
On the Pew Center, they did not list magazines such as The Economist or Time, Newsweek. Are they just read by so few people here that they don't make the list with even 1%?
Right. I think with that survey, they asked people the questions and they only list the ones that the people actually named. And so the Economist would probably have a tiny audience with most Americans reading magazines. Now, Newsweek has been in trouble for years. Yeah, they've changed hands several times. I thought they were going to disappear about 5-6 years ago. I'm glad they didn't. They've been a great magazine for a long time.
Would you talk a little bit more about newspapers and journalism being part of the instruments of truth? That's been a problem as far as many people are concerned in recent years.
Well, are you saying that they are inaccurate, or they've lost their interest in objectivity?
Probably the latter, and maybe they never had the latter. Depending.
Right. I agree with you. I think we made a mistake long ago by using the word truth and even using objectivity, because I pointed out earlier that often we don't know the truth, and so the best we can do is quote people representing as many sides as we can identify. If we don't have access, or we ignore certain groups, like the mainstream media did of African Americans until the civil rights era, you don't know what's going on in the entire community. You only know, say, if the editor of the paper has relatives who are in DAR and in junior league, that is going to influence the kind of stories the reporting staff will produce. And so you're getting an incorrect impression of what's going on. I think most journalists believe in truth and they believe in objectivity. They are goals, even though they can't deliver them. I think what they mean is fairness. Because often they don't know if a politician is telling the truth or not. But they can be fair to that side by explaining what he or she said, and giving the other side an opportunity to respond. I remember when I covered the mayor's race in Charlotte many years ago, the editors were very meticulous in measuring the number of inches I gave the GOP candidate versus the number of inches I gave the Democratic candidate. We look at the fairness as being extreme when you think about it in those days. The weekend before the election, the wife of a well-known banker in town filed an alienation of affection suit. Have you ever heard that term before? In some states, you could sue the mistress for breaking up your family. Well, a city councilwoman was running for re-election, and she had taken up with this banker, and the wife thought she would get even with her by filing this alienation of affection suit on the Friday before the Tuesday election. We didn't run the story because we thought she was trying to exert undue influence on the election. If she had filed it a week before, and we would have had time to analyze it and give all parties a chance to respond. But can you imagine today, if that story broke on Friday before the election, you know it would be in that afternoon's edition, online. In neither case would there be truth. It would be, you would argue that the community is interested in this story overwhelmingly, so you have to give it to them. And so you would quote the spouse, and you would quote the city councilwoman who was accused of adultery. I think the standards have changed over the years. I'm not sure I agree that they should have changed. I think that should be the rule today. We don't want people to file a suit just so they can get back at someone. We don't need to play that game. But it happens. I remember, you may remember the name Mary McGrory. She was a well-known columnist. She started out, I guess, with the Washington Star, and then when the Star folded, she became a columnist with the Washington Post. But in her early career, she covered the White House under President Kennedy, and she was probably the only woman, or one of the very few women, covering the White House, all the men knew about President Kennedy's affairs, and they just looked the other way. They, they didn't think it was a story. And somebody said in front of her one day, all of us knew. And Mary said, I didn't know. If I had known, I would have written about it. That's why access, diversity is so important. Having men and women and people from all groups as reporters and editors in order to get a full picture of what's going on. And journalists are just discovering a diversity and learning how to respond to it. I think they're doing a very good job versus the way they were doing when I began as a journalist. But now, as they shrink, how much commitment to diversity can they give?
There are not many cities that have more than one newspaper anymore. But in the old days when we did, in Huntington, we had two. One was clearly identified as Democrats and one was identified as Republican.
Yes.
It's okay because everybody knew their bias. That's not true anymore. But it's disturbing that there are so many communities that do not have a local newspaper. And that number is increasing. I know Youngstown, Ohio, a bigger city than Huntington, its only newspaper, and there it is. What are they doing? So we've seen newspapers, print newspapers are very expensive. And as communities have fewer businesses that advertise, there's not as much money, and that's a serious problem. We see that as the Herald Dispatch and the Gazette both get very thin. Time magazine is a simple thing now too.
Yes.
Not only local ones, but it's very upsetting to me that so many totally inaccurate and off the wall things come out of such sites as Facebook. I have seen it on Facebook, friends of mine who were quoting some unknown source that Bill Gates is putting computer chips in the vaccine.
Yes.
It's crazy. Mm-hmm. But this is spreading because people look at Facebook uncritically, apparently. I like reading some online newspapers. There's Axios.com. Delightful to read. Their byline is smart brevity. You can read it quickly, and it's a free subscription. It's just delightful to read. But then there are things popping up like the people who lost their jobs at the Gazette and at the Dispatch. We have a prize winner from the Gazette and others who have done, I forget what the name is, there are so many. Mountain Spotlight at West Virginia, Report to America, Down Truth, lots of interesting things. I have hope for that, but there is no filter on whether they are accurate or not.
Yeah.
Just like there's really no filter on the daily newspapers.
Yeah. I like the new papers where a journalist who's no longer employed, he and his wife may start a newsletter online. But the problem with that is, are they actually reporting though? I like their opinions, but are they going to inform me of something I need to know about taxes or the budget? Right. And I fear, no, we're not going to get that.
It's a great concern.
I appreciate your comment about in the other days when there were more than one newspaper in town, you knew one was Democratic and the other Republican. I worked at papers like that in Dayton and Atlanta. The morning paper in Dayton where I worked, the editorial page was Republican. The afternoon paper was the Democratic paper. But the reporters reported not based on the politics of the editorial pages. They covered the news, and they let the editorial pages have the opinions. I think that separation of so-called church and state is disappearing in American journalism. I remember, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to follow up and also give a plug for the Herald Dispatch. Okay, I am affiliated with it, but I think we're lucky to still have a print newspaper 6 days a week here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they really work to be evenly split, because I'll notice, and you probably all notice letters to the editors, some days you can see that the person speaking is Republican and think they're absolutely disgusted with the paper and will not subscribe. And the next day it's the Democrats who are absolutely upset with the paper and will never read it again. So
offend both sides equally.
Right.
But you know, when you read the news sections of the Dispatch, you don't get a sense that it's liberal or Republican, liberal or Democrat, or you don't get that. You may see that on the editorial page, it's going to be more conservative than, say, another newspaper you would read. But that's okay. That's where the opinions belong on the editorial page. And I have great respect for the Herald Dispatch, and I hope it pulls through well. I know they're working hard. But I remember, you know, let me know if I'm telling too many stories from the past. But I remember working in Atlanta when President Carter was running for re-election. And as you can imagine, there are many people in the newsroom in 1980 who knew Carter because he had been the former governor. And I remember when Carter was campaigning against Reagan, he made the comment that Black pastors could call him directly if they had issues, whereas they couldn't do that if Reagan were elected. Well, a few days later, the editor of the Atlanta Constitution asked me to sit in on a meeting with Jesse Jackson, that Jackson was coming in, and I said, "Why? What is he? Why is he here?" He said, "Because he wants to see the president." I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "He has to go through you in order to get an audience with the president in Washington." He said, "Yes." And so I asked him, what happens if the president loses re-election? What do you do then? He said, "We just get mean." But he didn't last very long. He was fired after Reagan became president.
You talked, Dr. Morris, about the billionaires supporting the Times and the Post. We're very fortunate, talking about the Herald Dispatch and the Gazette, that we have a family in town that is willing to support that. And I'm sure they're not making any money.
Yes, I've been exposed. Mm-hmm.
But that's a concern, that we have to depend on individuals to keep our newspapers. Yeah. We're not supporting them.
Yeah.
And we can't as individuals. What do we do?
It's very difficult, because most local papers have relied on display advertising, which was a major source of their revenue, and the classified advertising that Facebook and these other organizations took away from them. And while they have the digital advertising, the rates are not equal to what they were able to charge when they had the full page ads. You know, they're getting a fraction of what they used to get.
Yeah.
And I don't see a let up in that. So you may be forced to return a situation where wealthy people own newspapers and are willing to subsidize it, or they create a foundation to finance the operations of the newspaper. You know, the St. Petersburg Times was famous for that. It's now merged with the Tampa paper. But originally the St. Petersburg Times owner left his ownership in a will that published a newspaper for decades after he died. So you may see more of that.
And can you address, oh, hold on. Can you address something I noticed, and maybe Diane can help with this? So our newspaper size has gotten smaller, and I had a really hard time getting used to that. Then the print was wonky and it was too light, and I couldn't read it very well. And now it seems like they've kind of settled in on it's easier to read.
Yeah.
But is that another? I guess it's a cost-saving measure.
That's always been a problem because a newsprint is inferior paper, and they've always worried about ink rubbing off on their readers' hands. But a decade ago, newspapers were concerned about the price of newsprint, and so they went to a smaller layout in order to use less paper, and that smaller paper to me is unattractive. I got used to the old size of the newspaper, and I say this as when I worked in Austin, Cox owned several newspapers in Texas, and I was in charge of ordering the newsprint for the Texas papers, including they had a contract to print the New York Times Southwest edition. And we were very, very concerned about the price of paper. A third of the newspaper's costs went to the purchase of newsprint. And so you could see that if you could find ways to even save a little money on the price of paper or the cost of paper, you would help your operations bottom line. I don't like the smaller size, but I'm willing to live with it just to have it.
I keep saying that that I'm just so slow to change, but like you, I'm getting used to it. I'm getting used to it. Someone else had a question? Jenna?
Yeah, I do. Yes, I have a question. If you would just be kind enough, just briefly, to comment on the fact that the New York Times last week, I believe, changed the title of the op-ed section to guest essays, and also the use of profanity for the first time. I'm curious about that. Also, the importance of the publisher of newspapers versus the importance of the editor.
Yeah. Well, you know, in William Randolph Hearst's day and Joseph Pulitzer's day, the editor was the most important person at the newspaper. The publisher had a minor role, but as newspapers modernized, they needed a stronger business office, and so the publisher became the boss of the editor, and the publisher selects the editor. The opinion pages usually report to the publisher, the news to an executive editor. I was not bothered by their changing op-ed to essays, having read their explanation for doing it. I don't know why they had to do it, but if they wanted to, it's a good explanation. and it looks okay. It sounds okay to refer to them as essays. I like the old way too. I I guess I'm a creature of habit. I will probably slip and refer to their guest essays as op-eds.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions or comments for Professor Morris?
Can I pose a question?
Oh, yes, and I wanted, Dr. Dobbs, thank you. I should have done this at the beginning, but we had two guests today, Dr. Bill Bissett with the Chamber of Commerce, and we have our own Dr. Dobbs here today. So thank you for joining us, and yes, please.
So Professor Morris, what qualities are you, in your role as an educator now, what qualities are you looking for in students to provide the next generation of leadership in journalism?
Well, I think journalists have always been educators. The public just doesn't perceive them as educators. Because when you think about it, many of the new immigrants to America learned to read and write by reading the newspapers in New York and other big cities. During the Great Migration of African Americans to the North, the northern papers became instruments in education. The Black press initially welcomed the new arrivals and told them how to behave as citizens. I guess they thought people from Mississippi were unsophisticated and needed to be told what to wear and when to wear it, and how to be a good citizen, and instruct them on registering to vote and that sort of thing. Even though these things were for new arrivals, think about today. We still have to have information in the paper that helps people understand where they vote, when taxes are due, where schools are assigned, or new plans for changing school boundaries. We have to train our journalism students to put depth in their articles, not just repeat the press release, or God forbid, rewrite the press release, but to explain items that the public would need to understand, and to help educate them on the stimulus package, to help educate them on who the candidates are for office and where they stand on important issues. I think many journalism educators lost their way in recent years by rushing to embrace new technology without considering the content, the depth of the content. And I remember 20 years ago, all the rage was convergence, where you would have journalists appearing on television who wrote for newspapers, and you would have broadcast journalists writing for newspapers. Most of that was one-sided. You have journalists trained in print and investigations appearing on television, and very few broadcast reporters write well enough for newspapers. And so when you see reporters on CNN and MSNBC talking about a story they broke in another medium, it's usually the long-winded print reporter who is talking on television. And then there was a race after convergence to have videos in every story. You remember several years ago when you go to the dispatch site, you found videos there, they were part of that movement. Everybody learning to do everybody's job, and they forgot journalists need time to develop their stories and to give enough depth for people to learn something new and to appreciate what they just learned. Those mistakes are still being made.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions or comments? We're right at our noon time. Anyone else before we kind of close it up? Well, I want to thank Professor Morris for being here. I learned a lot. I like the history that he provided to us, and let's just keep hoping that we can keep our print newspapers, because I think a lot of us probably do like our print. So is there anything else to add, or anyone else have anything? Professor Morris, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time, and you put a lot of thought and effort into this, and I had some nice comments. So from the group, Bill Bissett said he had to leave a little bit early, but he really enjoyed it. So thank you for doing this, and we'll see everyone, if not before then, in June.
Thank you.
Take care,
Bye.
everyone. Bye. Thank you again.